the people who've organized this project on the 60s asked me to ask you some questions about your experience of the 60s. I guess the first question is, when were the 60s?
When did they start and when did they end?
Yes.
They started in 1958 and they ended in 1975.
Can you explain that?
Yes. They began really in California with a student march. And then it ended in 1975, again with the end of the Vietnam War.
Okay, so when people say the 60s, for you that comprehends a much bigger...
A 17-year period.
Time period.
That's right.
Okay, so viewing audience, Dad, of the Lessons from the 60s project, how you arrived at becoming a figure in the 1960s?
Well, you become a figure really by not being a figure. Two things happen. One is you step up to the plate and you say, I'm going to do something in this situation. So you do something in that situation, but you really don't know the end result of it, where it's going to lead. But you stepped up. And that's when things really begin to change. That's when the effects are known to you personally. So, for example, if you take Martin Luther King Jr., he steps up to the plate, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. And he doesn't know where all this is going to lead in terms of his own life. But this is what's going to happen to him once he steps up and steps out. And
all right, so tell people, because if people don't know your biography, the basic steps of your life that led you to become an intellectual, an activist, the co-founder of the Institute for Policy Studies.
Well, I co-founded the Institute for Policy Studies with Dick Barnett, who died a number of years ago. And the purpose of the Institute was to, in fact, tell truth to power. And if you look at the walls of the Institute, there's not one truth, there are many truths. You have to be in a position to be able to tell many truths. And that requires a place to be able to do that, and a place to protect and aid to keep it going. And so that was one piece of this whole story.
That was in 1963?
Yeah. It depends. You can look at 62, 63, but that's 1963 exactly. And so the Institute now will celebrate its 50th anniversary and continues with many different things having happened to it, to the people. Break-ins by the government, assassinations that had occurred by the Pinochet people. The result was deaths of colleagues, people very young, a 25-year-old young woman who was killed.
She was your assistant, yes, Ronnie Moffat.
Exactly. Ronnie Moffat, who was my assistant, and she was killed. And so it caused all sorts of turmoil. And one of the questions was, how do you defend the Institute during a period of turmoil, during this period?
All right, so just to finish up on your own kind of professional odyssey, what were you doing prior to founding the Institute for Policy Studies?
Before the Institute, I worked in the White House as a member of what was called the Special Staff of the National Security Council. And I worked for a man whose name was McGeorge Bundy. and he was the senior advisor at that time. And so I worked for him, and also worked as a member of a science group, which gave advice to the government, and that in the White House. And there I left because, in part, because of the war in Vietnam, knowing that that's what was coming, that it was clear that this was a terrible error that was happening.
Did you try to speak out within the White House against the developing war?
Yeah, I spoke out against it, and
how was that received?
Well, I was very young, relatively young. I joined the White House when I was 26. I was just 26. And I was there in that place from 26 to 28, 29, something like that. And in there, I did many different things. A major thing that I did, which was, there was a fellow whose name was Carl Kazin. And Carl was the deputy advisor to, deputy national security advisor at that time. He had come from Harvard. He was very smart. And he and I had a very complicated relationship because, and indeed I didn't speak to him after what I'm about to tell you, after he had done something that bothered me enormously, in which I said, if we do that, what gives you the idea that we're any different than those people who measured people for the gas ovens? And he and I stopped talking to each other for 35 years.
I could see how that would put a chill on the relationship.
What?
Yeah, I could see how that might have a chilling effect on your friendship. Well, this was in reference to Vietnam?
This was in reference to, that was in reference to Vietnam. It was in reference to a number of different things that already had happened that was just piling up. It was just, and he was interesting and very, anyway, I had just seen him recently in the last year or two, and he stayed with us. So there was this kind of a half-ass reconciliation and a remembrance of that period of time. So those were very bumpy days, and I had been asked to come to speak about those days at the memorial in Boston.
For Carl Kazin?
Yeah. And it was a memorial service for Kazin, for Bundy, and so forth. And the memorial was predicated on the idea of how courageous they were, that they had a radical, and that Bundy had hired a radical. And I refused and said, no, you made me a radical. And so, therefore,
there was no courage involved. It was an accident on their part.
That's right. Don't look to me to come to talk. So.
Well, and I noted that where they described you as the conscience of the National Security Council in the Kennedy White House?
Yes.
And you said that was a very dangerous thing to be?
Yes, to be a conscience meant that you had no power. And
You didn't want to be the conscience of the White House.
I had no interest in being so. You either had your own conscience, or there was none at all. But I'm not going to be powerless in this situation.
Yeah, you weren't going to accept all of the burden of morality for them, so they could go off.
No, everybody has his own conscience, his own being, as it were.
Yeah.
But to have it put into a lockbox, to use that recent term, and put it someplace else, well, that was basically, to me, quite absurd.
Yeah.
Quite absurd indeed.
So how did you end up leaving the White House then and going to create IPS?
There was no future for me in the White House. And there's no future really for anybody, in the White House. What people do once they're there is use that as a stepping stone for money or influence or power in other contexts later on. So that it always says in your obit that you were a member of the White House staff, or that you were deputy this or whatever. And you, as you know, in an obit, which everyone must read, I am a very great believer in the reading of obituaries and in preparation for what it is that your obituary is going to say. And you learn a very great deal about everybody's life, and American life, and world life, by reading how is it that people spend their lives. What is it that they do in their lives? And so in this case, I was concerned, would I get a Nobel Prize? Would I be known as somebody who was active with Dr. Spock in what was called the Spock trial? Where was I going to be in that list of names? Would it go Spock, Coffin, Raskin? How are they going to present me in all of that? So I was very aware of that, and indeed commend to your attention obituaries. Always have that
Okay.
in mind. But don't get overwhelmed by them. Just read them, see the way people live and who they are.
Okay, what are you doing as a boy and a young man?
Well, I was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, Milwaukee, Wisconsin is a very important place. It's thought of as a backwater to Chicago. But Milwaukee has its own character. And if you watch films a great deal, as I do, it always says he was from Milwaukee. That's a line in various movies. People come from Milwaukee. Don't go back to Milwaukee.
You certainly didn't.
But they come from Milwaukee,
Yeah.
right? So that's there. While there, it was discovered that I had absolute pitch, which I still, of course, do. And what that means, many people have relative pitch. And absolute pitch means that you can always be on pitch. So if you go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, 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 you always hit C, or you hit C, C sharp, D, D sharp. So you know that. Well, this was very exciting to have as a child to be able to do that. I mean, that's better than having a circus performer at home, right? So that was a piece.
And you were playing the piano.
Yes, and I began playing when I was 4. Now this is a very complicated story because I was really extraordinarily good, and I went to study at Juilliard as a special student there at Juilliard. Now, the interesting thing about musicians, if you read their lives, you see that most musicians, most pianists, do not give concerts all the way through the year. They play X number of concerts, and they teach the rest of the time. Because to live out of a suitcase is no great life. And if you look, for example, at others, like, for example, Franz Liszt, who is viewed as the modern pianist, he played only in public until he was 35, and then he went into a monastery. So it's a very interesting world, and you can just plot that with other people. For example, if you take Vladimir Horowitz, who was the most profound technician of our period, pianist, unbelievable pianist in that sense. He left after 12 years. And he had married Toscanini's daughter and left after 12 years, and the charge was that he was gay and this and that, whatever. But the point is that he was an extraordinary showman, but he left and so forth.
So, and you were a pianist?
I was trained as a concert pianist. So I went to Juilliard to study, and at that time, one of the places where you could go was Juilliard or the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. And the Curtis Institute is still there for that purpose of learning the piano, or learning an instrument. And it's full freight. They cover all of your expenses. And the money originally comes from the Curtis Publishing Company, which was very important over the years. I went there to play, and there were two great teachers of that time. One was Rosina Levine from Juilliard, and the other was Isabel Vengerova. And Vengerova was a frightening looking woman who weighed maybe 350 pounds. She was serious. And Rosina was frightening for all sorts of other reasons. And I was 16, and I came to Juilliard and then went to Curtis to play. And I saw her, and I played. And the Russian teachers of that time, in order to test you, would always play beat off the beat to see if you could stay on the beat. So if it's this, they like that, to throw you off. And indeed, it was a very frightening experience for 16-year-old. And so I ran back from Curtis to Juilliard, to the train station, all the way back. Now, in those days, as still, children have no rights with their parents. So their mail is constantly opened. Got to check on the child, who's the child's having pot with, who's the child sleeping with, whatever. You got to know what's going on every minute. And that was true, of course, during that period as well. And during that period, may she rest in peace, my mother would open my mail, and she would open my brother's mail, who's 11 years older than I. And just to give you a flavor of that period, still, my brother was a very great hero, in fact, in many, many ways, and was a captain in the Air Force and this and that, so forth, a bombardier navigator. But
In World War II.
in World War II, but when he received word from the government, my mother hid the letter. No, well, that's what you're supposed to do. You got something from the government, you hide the letter because it may be a problem. And that's what happened in that case. In my case, when I came back, I was told by I was waiting for the letter.
Which letter?
From Curtis Institute.
Oh.
Saying, you know, whatever happened to that letter? And my mother said, oh, you didn't get in. And my brother at that time said, what gives you the idea you didn't get in? So that's always been a mystery as to what it meant. And the reason that she was against it was that she ran into a pianist who was playing, who was a wonderful pianist, whose name was Frank Glazer from Milwaukee. But he was doubling at that time as a superintendent in the building, as a super. And she realized that there was nothing, there's going to be no future as a pianist.
I see. All right, so you go to the University of Chicago, you go to the University of Chicago Law School.
Right.
You end up going to work in Washington for Congressman Kastemeyer and a group of liberal congressmen.
Yeah, for first Leonard Wolf and Bob Kastemeyer, right.
And then that was when you went to the White House.
Yeah.
Then you left the White House, and with Richard Barnett, you founded the Institute for Policy Studies. All right, so that sets the table then for what these guys want to hear about, which is...
What do you think we've been talking about?
Well, we've set the table. So now,
Do you think this is all the youth wants to know? Is that...
well, so one question is, you first became a leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement when you wrote the statement called A Call to Resist Illegitimate Authority.
Yes.
That was published in a number of newspapers across the
Yes.
country. That became the basis for your indictment, along with Dr. Spock, William Sloane Coffin, Michael Ferber, and Mitchell Goodman in the so-called Boston 5 case.
Right. You know, the interesting thing about that, Jimmy, was it was not called an indictment. It was
An information?
Information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So there was an information filed against you guys. You were not arrested. You were never arrested, but the information was filed against you. How did you learn that you had been brought up on these charges? How did you first learn of the indictment?
In Washington that I used to go to, and in a hotel, and on the radio it came across on the radio, or at that time it's television as well, that I had been that the information was presented that Dr. Spock had been indicted, as they put it, with 4 others.
Mm-hmm.
And there were pictures then in the New York Times and in the Post, across the country.
So you guys were charged with conspiracy to aid and abet draft evasion.
That's right.
Did the 5 defendants know each other?
No, not really. The lawyers was one or two of the lawyers knew each other. The ACLU lawyers knew each other in the case.
But the people you were accused of engaging in conspiracy with, really, you didn't know?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Not really.
Had you met Dr. Spock before?
Spock came to the house.
But wasn't that afterwards that you became friends with him?
He came to the house, and my recollection, Jim, you'll remember this, is he
I had an injury that he took care of for me.
took care of you.
Yeah.
That you.
We were playing football, and I cut my hand, and he stitched it up. But that was later, right?
I don't know.
I think that was later because.
That may be.
Yeah. But okay. But all right. So. Describe what this call to resist illegitimate authority was about, what you had in mind in writing
The call
it.
to resist was a statement of saying there is such a thing as legitimate authority. And legitimate authority meant that it included justice and law together. And where those elements were not present, then it was behooved you to resist as a citizen, as a person. Either way, as a citizen or a person, you had to say no. You're not part of that. And you're prepared to support those who do that as well. And that meant that there were certain things, certain elements that a person had to live up to. One was that if you saw a person who was in need and you didn't resist, there was something wrong with you. So you had to be prepared to do that. The person, you had to make the judgment that the person who was resisting was doing so in good conscience. So again, the conscience is not set aside, the conscience is part of the day-to-day life of people. And so those elements were present at that time.
Because there were lots of young people who were burning their draft cards or turning them in and refusing to participate.
Who were burning their draft cards or turning them in. Some were burning them. And that was a statement that turned out to be a very interesting statement, because it meant that they were, and here, Coffin would invite people up to burn their draft cards. Well, he was the chaplain at Yale University. And as the chaplain at Yale, this was a very big deal, because everybody went to chapel in those days. And it was against the state, so the state was being burned symbolically by the church. And then there was another position. The position again remained underneath it all, the in good conscience thing. And as you know, when you can either affirm or swear. And so, people affirmed, they swore, whatever. But that was a very big moment in American history.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience of the trial itself in Boston?
The trial had many elements to it. One was a sense of boredom. There's a very great deal that goes on in a trial. That's just boring. And one of the people, Ferber, spent the time reading in Greek at the trial. And Coffin was burning for the churches.
The draft cards.
The draft cards, right. So we were seeing that. And people were trying to get next to Spock, who was everybody's baby doctor at the time.
Yeah.
So that was the major thing that went on there. The other thing, of course, that happened, which was very important, is that everybody who was in that trial, knowing, and this will give you a sense of the difficulty of trials, whether you're innocent or guilty or whatever, no one's relationship stayed, personal relationship stayed. Everyone either got divorced or separated or whatever, and the relationship ended.
Mm-hmm.
And so now know what it's like, where people who are, in a sense, at the top rung of the society, that this happens to. But imagine what this happens to people who have nothing and who lose everything at the same time.
Mm-hmm. The defendants and acquitted you.
Yes.
And I looked, in anticipation of this interview, I looked at a couple of the old books about this, and one of them said that, one said you joked about it and said you could demand a retrial in your case, but another said that you actually were devastated that you were acquitted and the others were found guilty.
Yeah, no, I was devastated, and I cried, actually, because, and then I was asked about it. I said, and I was asked by the various reporters, and I said that I felt very good for myself and terrible for the others. And my lawyers were very important in this case. I had the presence of mind to ask a lawyer whose name was Taylor to be my lawyer.
Wait, not Telford Taylor.
Telford.
Oh, Telford Taylor. Okay, yeah.
To be my lawyer.
The war crimes prosecutor.
Exactly. And I knew that if he was the lawyer, every time the case would be mentioned in the press, it would say the war crimes.
The Nuremberg prosecutor.
And that was a very important way to get the war crimes issue going. And there was, at that time as well, there was a book that was put out called In the Name of America. And In the Name of America was put together by Seymour Melman, who you may remember is a very dear and wonderful man. And he had gathered 300 pages of different things that had occurred that were alleged war crimes. And we were invited, the 5 people, Spock and different people, to meet with the deputy, he was the deputy attorney general, deputy associate attorney general, about what are we bothering with? Why are you bothering everybody? And we had come with 270 draft cards.
Oh, this is before the trial. This is before the indictment.
This is before the trial. We come with those. And to present them. Now, I knew that if you would bother the government, they would come after you. And Arthur Wasco, who at that time didn't know that he was a radical Jew or a Jewish radical, but just a nudge, said, "You've got to take these," and he pounded on the table and he said, "You've got to take these. This is going to. We're presenting you with evidence of a crime." And so then one of the people who was there said, "I don't recognize you people here at all. I'm going back to California where I have my own community. And I recognize that community, but I don't recognize you." And it got to me to speak. And I said, "Here is in the name of America, what you've got to do is investigate
These atrocities.
Mm-hmm. Because these are real, and those people who cause these atrocities, now you have to do something with."
Mm-hmm.
And so here is this case, this kind of huge mess of material, massive feelings, just a mess of the time. And during that period as well, the question was, if they are guilty, I am guilty. That was a big deal. And there were 3 pages in the New York Times of people who signed their names to ads. And those 3 pages were started with Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, very big.
Martin Luther King, right?
Martin Luther King, exactly. And so the people at that time who had stepped forward and they said, append your name to these names, and people, of course, do.
All right. Eventually, peace movement gets stronger and stronger. IPS gets investigated, broken into. You and Dick Barnett, I think Roger Wilkins, get put on Nixon's enemies list. Is that right?
I don't recall Rogers being on the enemies list.
Mm-hmm. But you and Barnett were.
Barnett and I are on the enemies list, yeah.
And there were undercover agents sent in to investigate you guys?
Yes, there were undercover agents. There were something like 14 agents who followed the Institute. 58 informers came to different sorts of events at the Institute.
That's one way to build your crowds.
And that was one way. Right. And as you know, there was that's what was called it was like the Hoover wing of the Communist Party. You knew that a quarter of the Communist Party was made up of the Hoover wing. So.
So.
The J. Edgar Hoover wing, just to be clear.
Okay, do you consider the 60s, writ large as people talk about them, a positive moment for American democracy or a negative moment?
I view it as a positive moment, very much so.
Why?
Because it was a statement of saying that as individuals and as citizens, you could resist. And there would be others there who would resist as well. And indeed, at that time, there were other movements. There was a document called Resistance. That was another group that had put together a document called Resistance as well. And then, but the call to resist turned out to be, I think, I say that with great ego, the most important.
Mm-hmm.
With great modesty and ego, that was the most important.
And the IPS has, under your leadership and since then, has tried to be a force not just in the question of foreign policy.
IPS has been blessed with great leadership, presently with John Kavanagh, who is an extraordinary leader and who is loved by everyone at the Institute, and who has a strong, a very, very powerful retentive memory as well, and a very great love of people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a friend to everybody at the Institute as well. So we're fortunate, fortunate in that sense. And it is, as you know, the 50th anniversary, as we said. And it's called 50 years and preparing for the next 50 years.
Mm-hmm. What do you think were the major successes of that period, and what were the failures, and what could have been done differently or ought to be done differently to ensure a more progressive future for people?
Each area, each time does not reflect on its own time. It reflects on the past. And one of the important things to do is to find a way of being self-reflexive about the moment that you're living through, which then becomes the basis upon which the next generation can build as well. And I would see that as a very important lesson to be learned, which was only learned in part.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, it would have allowed for coming to grips and with the question of how to confront and protect certain people, how to take into account who was to be protected, and not an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Tommy, do you have any questions? No? Mike Tabor, you have a question?
It'd be interesting to recall the different people you remember passing through IPS over the years, as teachers, as visitors.
Give me a name of two people who you would...
Well, I remember, I have a nice memory of Allen Ginsberg, being approached by Allen Ginsberg in the Xerox room. But of course, everybody involved in activism, I always associate with IPS.
Well, I think that's true. Certainly Allen Ginsberg was there. And
Ralph Nader.
Nader, I first became in touch with him, or he with me. It was walking past our house, and he came to the door and he said, "You should shovel your walk. Somebody's going to fall and hurt himself. So you better come out here and do that." So that was the first introduction to unsafe at any sidewalk,
Yeah.
or unsafe at any speed, depending.
Yeah.
But you knew that he would never use speed. They were just unsafe at any speed. So of course it's true. I mean, about the Institute, there was a huge number of people who came through. There was a fellow who worked for many years at the New York Times, who was a student, SDSer, and he came and he would use the old crank machine and run off stuff at the Institute. And he's just recently retired from the New York Times. I mean, there are all sorts of people.
You know, some of the spin-offs from IPS, Jeff Foe was involved in a spin-off, for
Yes,
instance.
I mean, the whole theory that I had of the Institute was that if you would get too big, you would start something else. Because what you're undertaking to do is not only build an institute, but develop a culture.
Mhm.
And spin-offs would lead to that culture. And each place would have an institute, and it got too big, it would move to the next step. So that was the story.
Impact of the women's movement on IPS.
Can I pause for a second to change the tape before
Sure.
I get to that question?
I mean,
I'll say something about that.
I remember Tina Smith. That changed.
Yeah, I think that's true.
What about the guy who wrote for the
Well,
Rolling
the
Stones?
women's thing was important because they were given
I'm sorry, go ahead.
a newspaper which was begun in the basement of the Institute by the women,
Off our backs.
called Off Our Backs. And that was a very important step forward for women, believe it or not. And then some of them left the Institute and they went off to start their own places at universities and to become head of different things. One was very Christian.
Marietta Wicks.
No, it was not she. But in any case, there were different people who had their own thing.
So what Esther suggested, which is to reflect on how the era of the 1960s affected you personally. Both the transformations, the social transformations you were part of, but also the conflict with the government and the constant investigations and surveillance. And stuff.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was everybody who was on trial ended up in a divorce situation, or that was something that had occurred to the people at that time, and there was a very heavy burden which was then carried.
Yeah.
And there's little to be said beyond that, except again to talk about this business about how to be self-reflexive enough for the time that you're living in to be able to use that as a stepping stone for the next generation, to be somewhat liberated. You can't ever get quite to the top of the mountain, but you don't have to fall quite as far down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a whole other story.
Terrific.
Anything on relationship with Dick Barnett? Work together for such a long
Well,
time?
let's just do one final thing then about that. Let's talk about your friends, because you've had
Right.
great friends through your political work: Richard Barnett and Roger Wilkins and Barbara Ehrenreich and Gar Alperovitz and
Right.
Cy
These are-
Hirsch and
Yeah, these-
Nader and
Yeah, these are all people who were part of our lives. And just to close with saying something about Dick. Dick was a terrific writer And one of his great books was Roots of War, which many people still read, or if they don't, should. It's a very important and very useful book. And but when he died, before he died, he was very ill and suffered from Alzheimer's, which was a great shock. And then he died. And Anne Barnett should be talked to about some of that, and she's written a book on border crossings, to look at that book and
Great.
talk about that.
We
All
should
right.
do the date of the interview.
Today is January 7th, 2013. Is it 7th?
And you didn't say who you were talking to.
We're talking to Marcus Raskin, and I'm Jamie Raskin, his son.
And
And this is Tommy Raskin, my son.
For the purposes of editing later, do you mind presenting yourself, saying your name and who you are?
Presenting what?
presenting yourself,
Say
saying your
your name.
name and who
I'm
you are?
Marcus Raskin.
I propose that you close by filming my dad play the piano. What do you think?
Sounds great.
Absolutely.
Why don't we do that? Is that right, Dad? Are you up for
Yeah,
it?
that's okay. You say.
Thank you so much.
You're still a child prodigy, Deb.
So did you force this upon Jamie? Did he have any musical?
He's fantastic,
No,
as a matter of
you know,
fact.
Tommy playing with me.
this can't be interviewed, but,
No.
you know, there's a
Memoirs now, and just going through a lot of this stuff, including Sir Donald Francis Tovey, who's the great expert on symphonies and chamber music and piano work and so forth and so on, and writing all that up, and then going from there into talking about Obama. That's a whole other story.
But is there something inspiring about music that's connected to radical politics? Maybe not radical politics, but the need to speak
Social
truth.
consciousness.
Speak truth to power. You know, is there a musical quality or influence to that, I wonder?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's not an easy question.
History of cantors and rabbis?
Well, there's the history of cantors, certainly.
Yeah,
So were you raised Orthodox? Or
No.
not at all?
No. No, but
Here, this is interesting. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's to put together the
Yes,
three
of
different
course.
things.
it's your protest song.
I got that. The first one. What was the first one?
Well, this is the Shakan, the Bach Shakan.
That was. I feel like you answered Michael's question in the music.
And then,
Yeah.
see, and then Yellow Rose of Texas.
Yeah.
A reference to LBJ, I guess.
Right.
We should go. Come on.